starting to hear sound. Tony, can you still hear the sound when I was muted?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Dude, we're live.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Trevor Schell, and I'd like to welcome you all to the third of our fourth weekly webinars being held during the month of February as part of our annual RSI Day webinar series, focused on the recognition and prevention of musculoskeletal disorders. OHCOW's RSI Day webinar series is officially the world's largest ergonomics-focused webinar, which is illustrated on the map you're seeing on your screen. As of this morning, we have 1,971 registrants from across 63 different countries, surpassing last year's record-breaking numbers. As I mentioned last week, my goal is for one day this map to be entirely red. The majority of our registrants, especially those joining us internationally, have learned about the webinars through your participation and sharing of the information. Please continue to do so with your friends and colleagues to help us expand our reach so that workplaces around the world recognize the importance of preventing musculoskeletal disorders. If you were unable to attend any of the webinars from the previous 2 weeks, you should have received an email earlier this week advising you that the recordings have been uploaded to our YouTube channel. If you did not receive it, please check your junk or spam folder. I'll also share the link to our YouTube channel in the chat during today's session. After each session, there'll be an opportunity to ask the presenters questions using the chat, which will be monitored by my colleague, Daryl Stevenson. So please post any questions you have for the presenters there. You'll also notice a survey on the side of your screen. Please take a moment to complete it, as well as the follow-up survey that will be available near the end of today's session. Feedback is important to us and helps guide us for future programming. Regarding education certification documentation can be provided. However, we first recommend that you check with your governing body to determine whether the Eventbrite registration confirmation is sufficient, since it does contain information for the session dates, duration, and topics, details that many accept as proof of attendance. If it's not sufficient, we will be happy to provide a certificate of attendance after the webinar series has concluded on February 27th. At that time, please email me with the dates of the sessions you attended. Now, our topics for today's session include the introduction of a new workplace assessment tool called PERAT, the Preliminary Ergonomics Risk Assessment Tool, which will be presented by Nathan Birtch, an ergonomist with the Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. Our second session is titled From Pixels to Prevention, How AI is Changing Ergonomic Assessment, and will be presented by Steve Fisher, an associate professor and associate chair of applied research, partnership, and outreach from the University of Waterloo. Please give us just a moment to switch over to get Nathan prepared. Nathan, are you all set?
As long as you can see my screen, I'm good to go.
To your screen, and we hear you perfectly. So
Excellent.
good luck.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Nathan Birtch, as Trevor said, and I'm a Canadian certified professional ergonomist and a specialized consultant in ergonomics with workplace safety and prevention services, and also a registered kinesiologist. So good to be here with you this morning, and it's my pleasure to present on this topic all about simplifying ergonomic risk, where I'll showcase this tool that I have developed with the help of WSPS and my colleagues there. And so I'm really excited to share that with you today. But also just want to say thank you to OHCOW for this free webinar series. And I think I speak for many of the ergonomists here when I say thank you for the continuing education points as well. So fantastic and awesome. Congrats on the record-breaking numbers here. So awesome stuff. Alrighty, so we'll get into it here. Just a quick disclaimer, first of all, just that anything you see here today as far as the tool is concerned, images, that sort of thing is all intellectual property of WSPS. So please reserve the temptation to take screenshots and kind of copy and that sort of thing. It is copyrighted, so just a quick disclaimer there for you. Here's where we're going for the session. So we're going to discuss, just to kind of set the stage as far as current tools that are out there as far as ergonomic assessments, checklists, that sort of thing. And then I'll kind of highlight, like some gaps that are there and, why we decided that this tool was kind of needed. I'll introduce the tool and then discuss the pilot project that we ran over the last, over 2025. I'll kind of discuss the results of that and how that went. And then if there's time, which hopefully there is, I'll do a live demo of the tool. But if we don't have time, it's okay because I have built the presentation to give you a good view of what the tool is, how it works, and how it looks. So we'll get going here. So what is the current state of kind of ergonomics tools that are out there? And I kind of put them into 3 different buckets here. So checklists, screening, and in-depth assessments. So checklists are really, those broad kind of scans meant for sort of just that hazard identification component, meant to be more observation-based, minimal to no time as far as training required, and kind of minimal time, 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the job, obviously, to complete that checklist. And that's really in that kind of early stage. It could be done on inspections from a Joint Health and Safety Committee standpoint, that sort of thing. I'm just going to turn off my video here just so that we're not taking up a lot of bandwidth here. And some examples there's one from Kodak. There's MSD Prevention has a bunch of checklists there that you can use for free, and we have one as well. So just a few examples there. And screening tools, they get a little bit more complicated, a little more structured. They do have some kind of prioritization, some potential risk assessment components to them. Some of them are more like a snapshot in time, which presents its own sort of challenges that way, as opposed to looking at a whole job. Many of them observation-based still in that regard, and moderate kind of training required, moderate time to complete, 15 to 45 minutes, depending on the job. And no measurements are generally required for the most part. And it's really that first level of review, can be done proactively or reactively, and kind of start to think about that prioritization piece with the screening tools. We think of RULA, REBA, caution and hazard zones from Washington State, quick exposure checklists, and even the kind of more state-of-the-art motion capture or sensorless motion technology tools that are out there. Personally, I'm putting these, and I know many other ergonomists do as well, putting these into that screening bucket, just because they aren't an in-depth assessment. They don't take into account some of the things like force and wrist posture and these sorts of things. So there's some missing things from those kind of screening tools, so not really an in-depth assessment. And then we get into the in-depth bucket, and it's more that comprehensive assessment where you're getting a lot of detail, a lot of data that's collected, and really, generally for the most part, kind of complex issues that we're dealing with. Generally, an ergonomist is doing this. It is more time intensive, so definitely more than an hour just to kind of collect the information. And then, the significant more time to actually do the report output. Gets more quantitative, more detailed, more technical, and we're usually seeing these being used by clients, companies for claims, for injuries, for kind of known problems that they're having a difficult time solving, need that technical expertise or a third-party review. And as ergonomists, we often pull in different types of tools like the NIOSH lifting equation, works ergonomic software from Potvin, 3D SSPP, OHCOW, Liberty Mutual, and anthropometrics, just to name a few. So it gets a little bit more complicated there. And you can see just visually here, even just some examples of these where we go from checklist to in-depth assessment tools. They get increasingly complex, and the knowledge required increases there. So the biggest reason that this tool is developed is because we really noticed kind of this gap, right? We have checklists, which, they don't provide a risk rating. They don't prioritize issues for our clients, our customers, our businesses in the province of Ontario. They don't provide any guidance when it comes to controlling the hazards they might find, and they don't have any design-related content. When it comes to screenings, generally a lot of them are observation-based. They're really looking at the posture of the individual when the one that you're looking at in the video, the photo, the particular job you're looking at. Often it's really just individual based, which is problematic. Is a snapshot in time and really doesn't provide guidance and control either or design criteria. Then when we come to the in-depth assessments, right, there's this big gap, right? They're time consuming, they're complex, they really require a high level of expertise, and they're not really required for every circumstance. And so there really is this gap that we're really really noticed and decided, you know what, we need to do something about this to try to provide a tool, and that's where our friend the PERAT comes in. So every good thing needs a good logo. So that's our PERAT logo for today. We're calling it the Preliminary Ergonomics Risk Assessment Tool. Okay, really, again, trying to bridge that gap. So what is it? It's really meant to be simple, easy to use, easy to understand, and you'll see a screenshot there on the right side of what the tool kind of looks like. It's meant to be kind of visually clear, one page. We don't want it to be multiple different pages. We want it to be one page, all kind of in one place. And quick allocation of risk and preliminary assessment is kind of the goal there, right? We could do a lot of them in a kind of a short period of time, a lot shorter than we could do an in-depth assessment. It can be done, the idea behind it was that it could be done by ergonomists. So filling out the form, completing the assessment by an ergonomist, but then also we can hopefully train others, you know, like a team of people or specific people at a place of work and business to be able to do the assessments on their own to really kind of ramp that up and help with their own internal program there as well. It's meant to be actionable, so really flagging things for those high risk components to support that prioritization, right? Where do we start as a company as far as implementing controls, or what needs to be further assessed? Often companies don't know where to start with this, so that's why another big reason we developed it. So it really is that kind of job or task assessment. It's more task-based. So if you have a complex job, it is meant to be separated into different tasks. But if it is a repeatable task, there's not a lot of variation, we could do it in one sort of assessment here. And then it really is then populated into a prioritization matrix. So you could do multiple tasks or jobs in kind of one form, and it all populates into one prioritization matrix to help you rank your jobs, your tasks for further assessment or control. So a little bit more on the why. As ergonomists, we use lots of different tools. It's hard to know which ones to use sometime, or we spend a lot of time kind of figuring out which ones we should use. So trying to kind of help with that as well to bring many tools kind of into one component, and I'll show you that in a little bit. The screening tools that are out there, just found myself, and I know many other ergonomists feel the same way, that they weren't really meeting the needs of us and our clients. But there really needs to be something simple that considers, you know, all workers, not just the individual and the posture they're in at the time. And so really needing something like anthropometrics and design measurements included, and you'll see that that is incorporated into the tool. We want to move just beyond those observation posture angles, right? And from a client standpoint, right, the current checklist that they have and they use, they're not really giving them any information as far as priority and prioritization. They might identify some hazards, but it's not giving that information to then prioritize. They might be limited in their resources financially and time-wise, right? As far as having people internally that can complete this with the know-how and the knowledge, or even getting in an external ergonomist to come in can be costly, time-consuming, so very limited that way often. And really thinking about these small to medium-sized businesses as kind of our main key focus with this tool, because often those larger companies, they have their own internal ergonomists, and they also often have their own internal tools that they can use. And so, you know, these small to medium-sized businesses generally don't have something like that. We find most assessments are reactive. So often as ergonomists, we're brought in when there's a problem, right? When there's an injury, and they want us to try and help and solve it. And so if we want to get companies, and this is really a mandate for us at WSPS, you know, prevention, right? We're all about prevention. We want to get people out of that reactive state into the proactive. And so they really need something simple like this tool. So how do we do it? There is some observation components where you know, if you have a video or photos, it's obviously very helpful for any assessment, but it is based on simple measurements. So, you know, tape measure does a lot. You'll see that in a moment with the tool where we're looking at heights, we're looking at reaches. If you have a scale, we're looking at weights of parts or things that are handled. Forces gets a little bit more complicated because not everybody has a force gauge, but we do provide some information and some statements that help with kind of estimating what those forces might be, similar to something like the Washington State caution and hazard zones, where they've given a statement or a comparable thing from everyday life, right? So we've provided some of that in the tool as well. There are Photos, videos are optional components to it. It is an Excel-based tool. So feeling like a little bit behind or analog compared to what Stephen Fisher is going to talk about later, but still, really trying to bridge the gap with something like this. So Excel-based tool, minimal data entry is the goal as far as keeping it simple. So mostly click-based as far as how the program works or the tool works. And it is all about that risk evaluation and prioritization. Again, some screenshots here. It's best used from a tablet standpoint. We have had some tablets that we're using and it's working quite well through Excel, and right, we can go on the floor, fill it out, and it's basically done by the time we get back to our desk, just minor things to kind of clean up and fill out. So that's really nice, but recognizing not everybody has tablets, and so there is the one page that you can print off and fill it out while you're on the floor. And then bring it back in and enter it into the Excel doc itself. Laptops are not ideal. We tried it. If you have a place to set your laptop down during, then great, but often that's not the case. Or you're going to be kind of pinch gripping, holding a laptop the whole time, which obviously as an ergonomist, we don't want that. So here's the tool. I'm going to break down into the different components of the tool now, just to give you a feel for how each part kind of works. So the top is more just kind of general details of the job as far as position, task, department, task description. So I won't get into detail with that, but it's these kind of 7 main drivers of the tool that I want to focus on to give you an understanding of kind of how the tool actually works. So really we're looking, and again, we're trying to keep this simple. So plain language, kind of layman's terms for the most part. So we're looking for things that are too low. We're looking for bending and twisting, side bending and twisting, things that are too high, too far away from the body, bending of the wrist. And then we're looking at high force when it comes to things like lifting, lowering, carrying, pushing, pulling, as well as hand force, things like gripping or tool weights and that sort of thing. So these 7 things are found that these are kind of where most of the issues come up when it comes to MSDs and physical ergonomics. And so that's why these 7 things were chosen to kind of go with as far as the main drivers of the tool. And what you'll notice here, below each column, each hazard there has a criteria. So how do we know when things are too low? How do we know when things are too high? And so on. Well, there's criteria that we can use to then kind of point us towards that. So it isn't just looking at posture. We're not observing necessarily, back flexion or shoulder flexion, though those are components of the tool, and I have put them in here as criteria because I'll explain that in a moment. But really, mostly, for the most part, it's the anthropometrics that drives some of this stuff. So how do we know when things are too low? We're not just looking at one person. We're looking at a measurement to help us understand. So for too low, it's that taller worker that is the limiting person, right? And so they're going to be the first person that has to bend when something is getting low. And so we're thinking about all the people that have to do the job. So anthropometrics are really used for that criteria for many of these components. As well. So after we look at kind of all those top 7 main drivers, each of them is then paired with repetition and duration. So we're going to look at if something is too low. So for example, this one is checked off here, too low for bending of the back, below that criteria that's there. And so is it done more than twice per minute, held for more than 10 seconds for more than 2 hours? If not, we're not checking it off. And so that kind of is how that next phase as far as repetition and duration is considered. And I'll kind of show you how those things paired up work as well. We also have our secondary hazards. These are not the main drivers of any of the risk evaluations. So low, medium, high, these don't impact necessarily the low, medium, high rating, but they do contribute to what we'll call a risk percentage. And I'll explain that in a moment. So they do affect some of the scoring that's involved. So we look at contact, stress, vibration, and could be hand, arm, or whole body, temperature, impact, stress, time pressures, and lack of control. So those last 2 being more kind of psychosocial type hazards. And there's also a box for just clicking off if there's something else that's not captured in any of those buckets as far as the hazards, then you can enter information in there. There's a spot for measurements, so none of this impacts directly kind of the calculations and the formulas involved in the automation of the tool, but it does provide information as far as qualifying or justifying why you chose something as, say, too low or too high. You're going to put your measurements in here. You're showing this in metric, so we do have a version of the tool that is metric and imperial, in case you're wondering. But this is where kind of all that data, that quantitative data, is entered in for reference, for understanding how you qualified or justified, but then also to help you as far as controlling that hazard as well. So heights, reaches, joint angles can be put in. We don't focus a lot on the joint angles just because, again, those layman terms are what we're going for. We're trying to keep it simple, but sometimes you have an indication or a posture, for example, the shoulder, where it's not considered too high, it doesn't reach that threshold as far as that measurement, but you still get an awkward posture involved. So we still wanted to have that option for awkward postures being considered that maybe don't meet that measurement criteria. And then just some details. So any additional details as far as the work that's done, the conditions that you evaluated, why you chose to kind of select it as too high or too low or too far, information about the frequency, all these sorts of things. So any general details that you want to include can be put in there. Again, we don't want it to be a lot of typing, and so there's not a whole lot of information space there to put in there. So we want it to be kind of simple and quick, right? There's a spot for images. Again, it's optional, but a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so if you have a screen grab or a picture of a hazard you identify, you can dump it in here. And then we have our controls section. This is meant to be, again, rudimentary, simple. Again, I want to stress this is not a replacement for in-depth assessments, where you're really going to get a lot of information on controls, especially, right? It is preliminary, so it is meant to be that first look or in-between look, almost like a screening where we're assessing things for risk to help us prioritize, but we're not giving a whole lot of detail as far as things like control. So keeping it simple. There is a drop-down selector for each kind of category that gives you maybe a place to start, but you can free type as well. But it's meant to kind of address those medium to high risk hazards that you're identifying. And one of those recommendations could just be recommend for further assessment. So to give you a sense of the risk assessment component related to, say, we'll give you an example of too low here. I'm not going to go through each one just because of the time that we have. But we give some information, and we do have a training developed for this tool as well, which I'll get into a little bit. But it goes over things like what is frequent, what is occasional, how do we define that, and what are the zones that you're putting this in. And so you can see the criteria here, right, is 86 centimeters for kind of that frequent zone. And that is based on anthropometrics. It's the taller individual's knuckle height, basically, right? If it goes below that, then that person's got to start to bend. And so 86 centimeters on a frequent basis is kind of your limit. If it's below that and you're doing it frequently, then we're going to consider that too low. We're going to check off the box here. If it's only done occasional, it's in that occasional zone. We can handle a little bit more bending down to the knee, for example. So knee height is what's used for that for the taller male. And if it goes below that knee height of 63.5 centimeters, then it's considered too low and we're going to check it off. So first you got to know which zone are we talking about, how frequently is this done, and which box are we going to check off, if any. Similar for, I won't go into a lot of detail because I want to give Steve some time later, but too high is very similar, right? This time we're using that shorter individual. So short female shoulder height, 125.5 is that height that kind of starts to kind of limit us there. And so we're checking that off if it's done frequently and it is above that. Okay, so these are our thresholds. So instead of, again, looking at a posture, for example, we're looking at a measurement for some of this stuff. Force gets a little bit different and a little bit trickier. I hesitated and kind of went back and forth between almost building a little calculator within the tool, but then it just became too complex. So I played around with using Liberty Mutual manual material handling equations from Potvin. and did some calculations and actually worked out really nicely at 11.7 kilograms as far as being kind of an acceptable limit for most lifts from like floor to above shoulder level without getting into those awkward postures, far away from the body, really high or something like that. So that was a nice limit that came out of that. And then I also have that limit of 5 kilograms. So if you're in good postures, it's not super awkward. That 11.7 kilograms is sort of the limit that I put in here. If there is an awkward posture that you're in while you're lifting, then it is that 5 kilograms. So again, this is not to replace an in-depth lifting assessment or manual material handling assessment. It's meant to just flag things for kind of next level assessment or more in-depth assessment. So that's why this limit is here for both lift, lower, carry, push, pull. It all worked out to 11.7 kilograms, unless we're talking about those awkward postures, as I said. So very interesting how it worked out like that. And then I do provide, because not everybody has a scale or a force gauge, just some examples here as far as estimation. So not perfect. Obviously, it's better to have a quantitative measurement. But if we're going to teach this to people, kind of layman's, joint health and safety committees, these sorts of people, we want it to be easy and that they can identify something without, expensive tools and that sort of thing, like force gauges. So then I'll go over the risk rating component here. Just to give you a sense here, so this one we see too low is checked off, that top box for the top hazard for too low affecting the back, which turns it yellow. So we see at the bottom, we've got that into that medium risk if something is too low. And then we see with too high, we have both that too high hazard checked off. So something is exceeding the threshold for being too high, but then it's also exceeding that repetition threshold. So more than twice per minute, or more than 10 seconds for more than 4 hours. So both of those are checked off, which then turns it red. Okay. So we've got awkward postures, things are too high, and we're doing it on a frequent basis, which then makes it into that red situation. You'll see that it outputs into different body areas. So we've kind of separated it. Again, don't want it to be too complicated, but we kept it to neck, back, shoulder, hand, and wrist as the main body areas. And the different hazards that we evaluate will output into the score levels here. So we see here the shoulder is red, the back is yellow, and the neck and hand and wrist are green. And then you get an overall risk rating, which is kind of your starting place as far as prioritizing. So if it's high risk, those are the ones you want to focus on. It becomes high risk overall just based off of the highest risk rating that you see from the hazards we just looked at. And then we also see a risk percentage, and this is out of 100. That the higher the risk percentage, the more an issue the job is. Now you can have kind of a lower percentage like you see here, the 27.5%, but still be high risk. That's because it's really a function of how many things we're actually clicking off on this page increases that score. So you can actually have a medium risk with a higher percentage than 27.5 there. So understanding that's a bit confusing, but it is really, it's the color that is the starting place as far as the risk points. So low, medium, high. Green, yellow, red. And so your red ones are the ones you want to focus on. And then that risk percentage really is if we have 10 high risk jobs, how do we know which ones to start with? Well, that's when you start using your risk percentage to kind of help you prioritize. All high risk or red jobs automatically get that automation message that says controls required ASAP. Or further assessment required. So both of those things are automated because we really want to focus on those high risk ones, having a further look, because again, this is preliminary, and then also further assessment to kind of understand, is it actually high risk? What do we need to do to control it? So we want it to be actionable, right? And then ultimately getting it into this prioritization matrix where you've assessed a bunch of jobs. In this case, it's 10. And we've got 6 high risk jobs. So those are the ones we want to focus on. And it also gives you kind of a ranking system there to help where do you start, right? You can also put in information as far as previous injuries, previous discomfort reports that affects that ranking as well into the prioritization matrix. And again, I should say all of this is automated. It automatically pulls into this prioritization matrix. And I won't get into a great detail on all of the reference. Spent a significant amount of time looking at various references on all of these hazards that we looked at. So kudos to all of the research that is previously done that I'm just basically pulling from all the different places and putting it into one. And so just a note that, this is not something that we're just pulling out of a hat. We are putting a lot of thought into kind of how we come up with this criteria and these thresholds. There are some assumptions and limitations which we have to understand, and I can't get into the detail of, how the tool was built specifically and each sort of category and that sort of thing. We just don't have time. But understanding specifically, for example, the lift lower conditions, right? That 11.7 kilograms or the 5 kilograms in awkward postures. There are some assumptions that we made to come up with those limitations. And so if you are outside of that, then that needs to be considered and understood. It is not a replacement for those in-depth assessments or analyses. It's really just meant to be that starting place. It's not designed for seated jobs. So the references that we have in there don't consider seated work. Those would be different, right? If something's too high or too low or too far, it's going to be different. And so it's not considered in this tool yet. That might be something we look at in the future. It is not, again, stress this, that is not a manual material handling assessment tool. So it's not a lifting assessment. It's not a push-pull assessment. It is that sort of starting place to flag things for further assessment. A couple things that it's maybe not ideal for is highly variable tasks. So if tasks have a lot of variety, they're different every cycle or every day, or they jump around to a lot of different things, it's maybe not ideal. But what you could do is then separate into, like we do as ergonomists, into kind of a task analysis where you separate into subtasks and assess them separately. Long duration or long cycle tasks, again, a little bit more complex. Maybe not ideal, but again, you could kind of break down into smaller chunks and assess that way. We do see and understand that it is beyond sort of that checklist. It's into that screening realm, maybe even kind of closer to an assessment, an in-depth assessment, but not as far as that. So we do see that it really, at this point, is best used when there's some training involved and instruction on using it. And so we are kind of not making it openly available to the public for that reason, because we want to be able to train people to use it and to use it properly. So I'll go over the pilot that we went over in the next few minutes here. And then if there's time again, I'll kind of bring up the Excel and kind of go through it a little bit. So we piloted a project in 2025, which was backed by Workplace Safety Prevention Services. And we wanted it to be a zero cost project for the clients that participate. So we were able to deliver to these clients a great service at no cost, which was fantastic. It was all over Ontario. So all the participants within kind of mostly southern or southwestern Ontario, with a few up a little higher. We gave priority to clients with limited resources or budgets and those who might have high injury rates. And we provided up to 1 full day of assessments. So doing those PERAT assessments for the full day, and then the reporting time associated with after. We had 9 ergonomists, so shout out to all my ergo crew from WSPS, all the names you see and the faces you see on the ergo bus. We did not have a bus for this. We're not a rock band, unfortunately, but fun graphic there. So 9 ergonomists participated from WSPS. And overall, we had 22 clients, and all those projects are complete. We're done in December. We then gave client feedback surveys, which I'll show some results of those surveys as well. So overall, as far as sector distribution at WSPS, we serve the manufacturing, service, and agriculture sectors, those 3. And so those were the focus for us because that is our mandate. There were a couple that were outside of those sectors. I think one was a golf course and one was a long-term care facility, but mostly staying within those 3 sectors, obviously the manufacturing with the brunt of them. Significant investment. I want to just shout out to WSPS for investing in this, in us, in this time, and putting and developing this tool and piloting it. 167 hours we spent as ergonomists working on this, toying with it, changing it, and that doesn't even count the development time required by me and some others, and the tweaking and that sort of thing that we went through. But generally, some pretty good results as far as the efficiency and the time that it took. So we found about just over half an hour on site collecting the data, getting the information, completing the form, and then about an average report writing time of half an hour for just over an hour for each assessment total. And now I will say many of those were done on paper, not using a tablet, so a tablet would even speed that up even more. So we were able to complete 156 assessments for this pilot, and which outputted 484 hazards that we identified. And then overall risk level distribution for the tasks that we looked at. We see a lot of kind of high and medium risk jobs with a few 16 low risk, and we see that risk distribution being higher on the kind of medium and high risk because a lot of the clients that we worked with, they were often giving us, the jobs that they knew they wanted us to look at because they were a problem already. So we're going to see that risk distribution higher on the kind of red yellow side for sure for that reason. And overall, 641 recommendations we had output in those reports, which is fantastic. As far as the feedback that they provided through the surveys that we put out, so some of the questions we were asking, we asked them to answer if this was true or not, or rate them. The PERAT provided information that provided actionable data I could use immediately, helped prioritize tasks for further assessment, helped determine tasks of concern, helped identify MSD hazards, and most people giving positive feedback on that, either strongly agreeing or somewhat agreeing, with a few kind of neither agreeing nor disagreeing. So good feedback results there. And I think we had 18 total of the 22 participants fill out the survey. So pretty good return there as well. We asked to kind of rate them on the ease of understanding of the tool and the output, and they were rating it pretty high at 4.4 out of 5. We asked if they would consider using it again in the future. 76% saying yes, 18% saying unsure, a few saying no. And as far as future use of the PERAT, what different options would they consider? So would you consider having one person trained to be able to perform these assessments internally? 5 saying yes. Consider using the tool to help build an ideal job rotation. 5. Consider having our engineers trained on this tool to help encourage ergonomics in job design and equipment changes. So 6 saying yes. And consider having a small team of people trained. 6 saying yes to that. And then finally, consider having the PERAT done for all jobs and tasks. 7 people saying yes to that. Overall, we asked them just an overall, how would you rate the tool? And again, pretty high, 4.7 out of 5. So really happy with those results and the feedback we got. Just some kind of quotes for you. I won't go through them all, but just putting them on the screen so you can see there's some pretty positive feedback there as well, as far as things feeling straightforward, easy to understand, satisfied with the assessment, really helpful. A couple, one saying, focuses too much on posture, not enough on force. Like these sorts of things are understandable and valid. And I will say we have made some changes to our tool since the pilot as well, based on the feedback that we got. And I think we probably don't have time for the demonstration component, unfortunately, because I'm getting close to my limit here. If at the end, if we have time, I'll pull it up. So what are our next steps? And I also want to recognize that giving question time as well. So again, we implemented many different improvements to the form, to the tool itself, based on the user feedback. So that's the clients, but also the ergonomists, as well as some others. I had some representatives from CREA-MSD and from Ministry of Labor, Immigration, and Training Skills Development. So lots of different feedback sources that we used and continue to use. We have a formal launch at the end of this month that we're hoping to get it out. It is, again, not open to the public to use at this point. And we kind of hesitated whether presenting this to everyone with that in mind. But eventually that could be the case. It may kind of be publicly available, but at this time it is not. And the reason for that is, one, it's we want it to be trained. We want people to be able to use it correctly and not misinterpret, right? We already have many people lined up as far as projects to actually continue to do these assessments, and as well pairing those assessments or the tool itself with training. So training other clients to be able to use it themselves, which I just finished our first one last week with a client, and it went really, really well, and they're really excited about it, and yeah, really happy with the results there. So it is getting out there, and that's kind of an add-on offering to the tool itself. We have seen too that it is paired well with physical demands descriptions or physical demands analyses. So it can kind of work side by side with that. And we often are seeing that, you know, the physical demands, they don't provide information on risk level, they don't provide information on, you know, controls. And so they need that often and want that, but they do need the PDD or the PDA as well. And so those things combined can work really well together, like collecting the same information for the most part anyways, right? And we're going to continue to explore enhancements, feature updates, you know, maybe something like web-based version of the tool instead of Excel. Looking at, as I said before, kind of the seated measurements or seated tasks, maybe incorporating those. So we'll kind of see where that goes. We'll let the parrot take the pilot hat off, and he's going to fly away and do some good. So I will leave it there for my presentation because I want to give some time for questions, but I have not been following the chat, so I'm hoping, I think it's Daryl that's going to mediate that for us. Or anyone from OHCOW.
Okay. Yep, I gotcha. It's a lot of questions on kind of how the measurements are being done. Are the measurements being done from the floor to the top of the object being lifted?
Well, it depends, right? From the feet, basically. So where you're standing is kind of the key there, where the worker is standing. So it might not be, it might be a platform. So it might be the platform to where their hand is, that sort of thing.
Okay. And
That
how
answers
is
that
the
question.
86 centimeter decided on? So is each person have a
86
different?
centimeters?
Yeah.
That is knuckle height of the tallest individual. So 95th percentile male. And there is an account for boot height with that as well.
Okay. And if the assessment is done on a work shift, which do you use, the worst case or the most common case?
That's a good question. I think you would want to understand the worst case for sure, but you could actually assess both and kind of see if there's a difference. But again, sort of the only way that might impact things is probably the repetition and the frequency side of things. So that's where you might see that change, but you probably want to understand both those conditions.
And how are the thresholds for the different risk levels determined?
Thresholds for the different risk levels is determined by the criteria that we put in there. So maybe why don't I just bring up the tool? Let's do that. One moment.
Okay.
You can see it there, Gerald?
Yep.
Yeah, so as I was kind of saying, hopefully you caught this, but these 7 things, too low, side bend twist too high, etc., these things at the top, these are the main drivers, and each one has a criteria. So your too low criteria is, you know, 86 centimeters or 63.5, depending on the frequency that you're accessing that level, basically, right? So if it exceeds that criteria, we're checking it off. And in this case, this first one here is checked off. If it's not checked off, it's green. If it is checked off, it's yellow. So then we come down to our repetition and we look, is it done more than twice per minute or held for greater than 20 seconds? and more than 2 hours of the shift? If so, we check it off and it becomes red. So each kind of risk threshold has a criteria that we're matching, you're trying to find and measure it against, basically. So you see the details down here. Example, these pallets are 62 centimeters. And so that is below that 63.5 if it's accessed occasionally. And so that's why that one is checked off, for example.
Okay, great. And someone commented, please comment, I find the statement that one is using anthropometrics and then referring to a fixed height and distance confounding, as anthropometrics particularly varies angles used when working.
So anthropometrics, we do vary it. We consider the limiting user, basically, is kind of, or the limiting worker. So for too low, we're using these fixed numbers because that is based on the taller individuals, because they're the ones who are going to have to bend first, right? Too high is based on the shorter workers. So we're trying to consider all the population of people that might be doing the job. So too high starts with the shorter worker, their shoulder height, and kind of going above that. Too far would be the shorter worker as well as the limiting worker. And so that reach away from the body starts with the shorter worker. They're going to have to reach sooner than a taller one. And so that's where those thresholds kind of come from. Hopefully that answers that question.
Okay. Great. Yeah, there's some more specific questions you might want to look at after in the chat. Things like, so why limit the Liberty Mutual versus the ISO 11228-3, which distinguishes multiple population groups?
So why am I using Liberty Mutual? Is that the question?
Versus the ISO.
I find it to be a better tool that is easier to understand and use, and it's more accurate, I think, as far as the outputs and the inputs. It's up to date. It's more current, which is again another reason I went with it. But it's not a lifting assessment tool. It's really just meant to kind of flag at a certain level, and it worked really well to use that tool to come up with some kind of threshold. I figured we had to have some kind of threshold. And so using an assessment to come up with that threshold, using a lifting tool to come up with that threshold made sense. And that's the one that we use often, actually. So.
Okay, great. And then last one, will the tool be made available in French?
Great question. That is a goal because we are in Ontario. We have both languages. It's ideal for sure. So potentially it is not available in French right now, but that would be a goal for the future for sure.
Okay, great. If you want to put up your contact info again, there were more questions coming up as we were asking you there, a little more specific ones. If you could email Nathan, that would be great. As we're going to move on now.
Actually, Nathan, we still have about 7 minutes if you want to give a walkthrough of it.
Okay, sure. Okay, so just at the top here, as you can see here, right, it's the general information. So job position, task, department, general information. Who did the assessment? Shout out to Connor McErgo. He's fantastic. And shout out to Team Canada right now. I don't know if anybody's following that game right now, but I'm tempted to put it on the side of my screen, but I won't. Go Canada. So just general information there, the date, the location, that sort of thing. A pretty quick task description as far as what the job is, what they do. And then we start kind of getting into the different components here. So we're looking for things that are too low, right? So in this example, again, as I said, we measured our pallets at 62 centimeters. They're kind of handled occasionally. And so then we check off it is too low. So it becomes yellow. It's not done more than twice per minute or held for greater than 10 seconds. So we're not checking off that yellow. But again, at the bottom, we have our heights. So we've got pallets, conveyor, different things that we might want to put in here as far as the components that we're interacting with. And there's a space for that we can put range of motion for different joint angles if we want. Again, we kind of drive most of it by the measurements themselves because we don't want to go by just posture. But there's drop downs for the different body parts that might be affected in this particular category. And so again, we want to minimize the typing, so there's drop downs built in throughout the tool. And the details section, again, just kind of general details as far as what the job is, how you qualified or justified things to be too low, what some of the different conditions might be. A spot for pictures, if you want, you can dump it in here to kind of highlight that hazard. And then, very simple kind of controls, which again, we have a drop down here, which is rudimentary kind of controls for that category. If something's too low, we got to raise it, whether it's the items, the work surface, the pallet, the bin, whatever it might be. Equipment, very kind of rudimentary, but you can actually free type your own controls in there as well. And we just kind of work our way across for all these different categories doing the same thing. Does it meet this criteria that's here? If so, we're going to check it off. Is it done repetitively? If so, we're going to check it off or held for a long period of time. And it kind of flows through there as far as automatically populating. And you'll see all the things that we kind of check off here are going to impact the score above. And that risk percentage is going to increase as we go as well. As I mentioned, these secondary hazards here they do contribute to that risk score. So if I click them off here, it does increase the risk score, but it's not going to change our overall rating because the overall rating is based on these kind of 7 things here. So the more you check off, the higher that score is going to go, making sense, right? The worst jobs have the worst amount of things going on. There's a spot to kind of put whether this is an occasional, whether it's kind of not daily, it's rare, it's occasional, it's frequent. How often is this task done? Because that will kind of prioritize your jobs as well. And then this automatically populates as far as whether controls are required or further assessment is required. The reds automatically get controls required ASAP and require further assessment. If I take away the red, then it's implement controls when able and further assessment, not necessarily at this time. So some automation built in there as well. So that's kind of a quick rundown of the tool. Again, it's meant to be very kind of rudimentary, quick, first level look at things. It's not going in depth into kind of any of the potential things you might need to. It's meant to flag things, again, to kind of then put it into our prioritization matrix, which I also have room to put if there's previous injuries or discomforts. We can also put, maybe we have 2 previous injuries in the year, and that might change the ranking to bring it up. Same with the reports of discomfort, that's going to change that ranking as well. So that, and there is a training that we've developed, I'll say that as well again, that it goes along with this tool that is meant to be more practical, hands-on. So there's some foundational training that we have done with it, and some foundational information that we're providing first before then launching the tool to them, then actually practicing filling it out and assessing, getting out on the floor, getting out and looking at jobs and using the tool. That is a very quick run through of the tool. I will say too that the Excel does have 25 different tabs, so you could assess up to 25 different jobs in one Excel document if you wanted, which would then populate into our prioritization matrix. So you could assess a whole department if you had 25 jobs in a department, assess a whole job in one Excel doc. One thing we might look at too is expanding this to more than 25, because if there's an appetite for that, that might be the case. But we're going to leave it at that for now, just to kind of keep it, again, simple and not too complex. Are there any more kind of questions that jumping out to you guys? OHCOW, Daryl, Tyler, Trevor?
Actually, there is one. It says, while I understand this is not for public at the time, is this something that return to work specialists at WSPS should be trained on?
Yeah, that's not really the goal of the assessment, the tool itself, as far as them being the users. I don't know that it's preliminary, right? And so to make sort of return to work claim decisions on a preliminary assessment likely isn't kind of advisable. That would be more like your in-depth assessments, right? Where that would generally be required. So that's kind of a caveat with the tool, is that it's not meant to be that in-depth. And so those complex issues where we know that there are injuries, we know there's concerns, we know WSIB is already involved, we probably want to have a more in-depth assessment in those circumstances. So it's probably not something that's going to get sent to WSIB is what I'm saying.
Okay, great.
Thanks for putting my email there, Trevor.
So yeah, I've just posted Nathan's email. If anyone that has specific questions about the tool, you can reach out and contact him. Nathan, thank you very much. I love seeing something new, something different, especially something that's homemade here in Ontario. Always exciting to see that happen. So thank you very much for sharing that with us today.
Thanks, Trevor, and thanks everyone.
And we're just going to take a second to switch over to Steve, who I'm really excited about this one, Steve, and seeing where everything's going in the new direction with technology.
Excellent. Thanks, Trevor. Just quick confirmation, you can hear me okay? You can see my screen okay?
Yep, everything's great.
Fantastic. So yeah, as Nathan mentioned, really want to say thank you to OHCOW for making this possible today and doing all the great work to share all of the MSD prevention insights across the various weeks as we celebrate, seems like the wrong word, but recognize RSI Day. So what I'll do here, I'll just kind of say hello and wave first so folks can put a face to a name. But much like Nathan, I'll black out the camera here just to preserve bandwidth for those that have lower capability there. What I wanted to do is chat a little bit about the growing use of computer vision in ergonomics assessment. So like the title says here, effectively going from pixels to prevention, and what does that look like? For some of you, you may have had a chance to see, we shared some of this information recently at the Ontario Health and Safety System Research Day, hosted by MLTI, ISD and WSIB. And we've also shared a little bit of this in a past RSI Day. So I'll recap some of those findings, but stay tuned for those of you that have seen some of those early findings. The latter half of this presentation speaks specifically to how computer vision was used to populate a NIOSH lifting equation as an example use case, and I think there'll be some really interesting insights that you'll appreciate. So if you've seen some of the early slides, don't worry, there's some new things at the end, but I know OHCOW does a great job of marketing, so we have a massive audience here. Many of you that may not have seen some of our preliminary results, so I do want to start with some of those as a focal point. So as Trevor mentioned, my name's Steve. I work here at the University of Waterloo in the Department of Kinesiology and Health Sciences, and I also serve as the Associate Director of Research for CREAMSD, our Center for Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders. And I share that with you primarily because I want an opportunity to, if those of you have a phone, you want to take a quick picture of the link, just to share that one of the things that CREAMSD does is manage the MSD prevention guideline for Ontario. Now, while it says guideline for Ontario, the resources are free for use, can be publicly used. And I know we've collaborated with groups like MSD Labs in the United States and some construction groups in New Zealand and other places to customize and tailor resources. So for those of you looking for just simple, easy guidance on MSD prevention, certainly check this link out, and I'll have this QR code at the end of the presentation as well. So why am I here? Why do I care about computer vision, particularly with respect to MSD prevention? The data you see on the screen here is Ontario specific, but MSDs are the leading cause of claims in Ontario. And that's been status quo for some number of years. So if you're looking at the plot, that kind of teal blue at the bottom, sprains and strains, MSDs, has kind of always been the largest proportion of claims over the last decade. 35 up to 35% of all claims, even coming through COVID-19 when we were recognizing COVID-19 in terms of some of the compensable compensable statistics. While that certainly upticked the data, as you can see in the 2021 bar, still overshadowed by MSDs. Even though fewer people were out and about and working, it was still a dominant problem. And it's costly. In Ontario, we spend $1.5 million a week. 1.5 million per week dealing with MSDs, predominantly injuries described as being overexertion or injuries described as being dynamic or repetitive movements. So again, thinking about some of those risk factors that Nathan was just talking about. This is a massive number to me. And again, if we expand this out across Canada, or we look at injury data from the United States, the US is interesting. They're almost $1 billion a week. So for those of you joining us from the United States today, it's a massive, costly problem, which is why it's so important that we have resources to support MSD prevention. Well, can't we just race to a solution? So many folks that are trained in health and safety or come from an OHS background or an ergonomics background are probably familiar with the RACE model, where we recognize hazards, assess risks, control hazards, and evaluate controls. And I really appreciated the PERAT tool and Nathan's presentation, because I think it was a nice setup here where it's this kind of hybrid between recognize hazards and assess risks, which, as Nathan noted, was a bit of a gap for many workplaces. But if we think, and just kind of reflecting on some of the notes that Nathan mentioned, if we kind of think a little bit more in this space, what we're trying to do with hazard recognition is often look at things like force, posture, repetition in the context of other environmental factors, etc., and trying to understand that mix and interaction to assess risk. So as you see in the image in your bottom right, a trained observer might be documenting the presence of different hazards, perhaps using the PERAT tool to capture some of these elements so that risk can be identified, controls can be implemented where necessary, or even upstream, we can begin to prioritize if we're looking at several jobs within a workplace a little bit more proactively. So we have some tools to do this, but I think, again, Nathan did a great job of highlighting this. Many of these tools require pencil and paper. Some are sort of Excel checklist based, which is great for many users. When we look across the literature, not on tools, but on the development of tools and the interfaces and how we interact with those tools, there's some really interesting takeaways. And just to be crystal clear, what I've done here is actually populated this using AI just as a backdrop for our conversation, but it's adapted. So this is based on the paper noted in the bottom right here, and then used AI to synthesize and compile all of these different insights from the Mas Diego study, the Buckle and Lee study, and of course from the Eliasson study with Carl Lind's group in Scandinavia, Sweden, sorry. But what you see here on the list is, what are people looking for in a tool? Well, clearly they want something that helps make a decision. So we're looking for decision support. That's pretty clear. For many practitioners or experts or ergonomists, we want things that are quick and easy, clear and simple. And I know Nathan and the team have worked really hard at WSPS to include that in PERAT as well. We want tools to be valid and reliable. And I noticed in the comment thread during the last talk, there was a few comments around, how do we validate these tools and these types of things. Reliability is really important, which, as Nathan mentioned, around training, really crystal clear that we have that sort of thing. But how do we include the worker? Are things fast and easy to use? Are they based in scientific evidence? So all of these overarching principles impact how we use tools and also who can use tools. How accessible are our MSD tools? As an ergonomist, obviously I have a huge repertoire of ergo tools. As a professor, I have to teach many of these tools. So I spend every day in tools. But if I'm part of perhaps a joint health and safety committee, or I've been asked to sort of step into a role to provide some support for my workplace related to occupational health and safety, and I don't have the luxury I have here of being in the tools every day, it can be difficult to understand which tools to use and when to use them. And there's a pretty steep learning curve, and I think Nathan mentioned this as well, pretty steep learning curve in terms of how we pick up some of these tools. So is there a better way? And what we're seeing certainly commercially is that there's a growing push, I think, to provide computer vision. So just using your smartphone and using that phone to become our eyes. And from that computer vision application, we can detect things like postures and get an idea of the postures that folks are using and the frequencies of motion. And again, capturing particularly around posture and repetition. Force, obviously, still need to measure and manually enter, but we can start to explore how these tools might augment our ability to complete an ergonomic assessment. Perhaps, don't quote me on this just yet, because I'm going to talk a little bit more on the science, but one could imagine that it's as simple as point and shoot. We can just point a camera, shoot, and have an ergonomic analysis. Well, now, doesn't that democratize the process of doing ergo assessments and make it much easier for all of us to access some of the capabilities necessary to assess risk, prioritize, and implement controls? Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, and that's largely what I'll talk about today. There's some context around this. Why do I really care about this? Well, interestingly, if you do a bit of a market assessment over even just the last year, so Cordy, one of the largest sort of EHS software suite providers in North America, they launched a motion capture solution. Dorn Companies, who some of you may be familiar with, has partnered with 3Motion AI to introduce motion capture solution. Velocity EHS, again, kind of a massive EHS enterprise. They've strengthened their AI innovation with some new patents around motion capture, markerless motion capture, smartphone technologies. So there's lots of growth, I think, in this particular industry right now. So what I'll do, and this is a bit of a recap for those of you that may have saw the OHS Research Day talk recently, or last year's talk at RSI Day, but just for the audience, I want to level set a little bit here and clarify. Are these smartphone technologies, computer vision-based technologies that use your phone to attempt to see joints and angles in the body, is it as simple as point and shoot? And we had some great partners, Cargill, who is a North American sort of food provider business. We had some funding from Korea MSD, and as I mentioned, MSD Solutions Lab in the United States. And we had a wonderful partnership with a number of companies that commercially provide computer vision technologies. And I really want to pause here and say a big thank you to these companies, because what they did is allow us to use, sorry, I'm just seeing some chats pop up here. Close my window there. What they did is allow us to use their technologies so we could begin to understand how different platforms, how different solutions that are available in the market might influence the types and quality of data that you get. So this was really a little bit unheard of that they were so willing to share. But I think it's because we're all trying to understand how AI might help. So it's really important that we're transparent, both as companies and as researchers, in what works well, what doesn't work well, and how do we build trust in when we can use these tools and when we shouldn't use these tools moving forward. So I really applaud all of those companies for being so wonderful to work with. So like I said, there's a really detailed presentation that Dr. Larson gave out of our lab last year for the 2025 RSI Day. I'm going to take a few moments just to summarize and recap some of those at a high level. But for those interested in a deep dive, certainly check back through the OHCOW YouTube, and you can check out Dr. Larson's presentation from last year. But just as a brief kind of summary, what we did is launched a research study where we asked the following question. Among healthy, able-bodied, maybe you can read better than I can today. Among healthy, able-bodied individuals performing a series of simulated occupational tasks, does the angle of video recording, the task pace, or the computer vision platform influence how we measure trunk inclination, so how deviated the trunk is from kind of an upright posture, or shoulder elevation, so how high the arm is relative to the trunk? And we compared those relative to a lab-grade motion capture system. So I'll walk you through what that looked like. We chose 6 simulated occupational tasks, and we performed them in a controlled lab environment. So I acknowledge that some of the limitations around background noise and temperature and contrast and other things we certainly were able to control for in a lab environment that might not be possible in a work environment. But we wanted to replicate things like, kind of an overhead assembly task. So we had a little key tag task, as you can see in the top left, working with Cargill, who does a lot of meat processing and poultry processing. We had a simulated knife task or a simulated deboning task. In the top right, spent some time playing with some Play-Doh, but mostly as a means to simulate packaging. And then down in the bottom, we have some of the more classic manual materials handling activities. So we have sagittal plane lifting, a palletizing task, and a push-pull task. And we had folks do these a little bit slowly and then quicker at a faster pace. So here's just a quick example of two tasks. So on the left, you see the above shoulder work task where we had an individual just replicating motions that you might see in kind of an assembly task where you might be working at shoulder or kind of head height. And then on the right, you see a simple palletizing task. Imagine, taking boxes off of a pallet or restacking, reloading. And we did have the opportunity to capture some additional measures. So you see she's wearing some sensors on her body. We have some force plates there and some insoles data that we're using to sort of develop future forward models and better leverage AI. But for the purpose of today, what's most important is the video images. And the system that we have in our lab enables us to capture synchronized video from 8 different perspectives all at the same time. And we can use those 8 different vantage points into a markerless motion capture solution that's very much a lab grade solution named Theia, as you can see on the right here. And what Theia does is take all 8 cameras, so it does require a lot more information, but it triangulates that data and gives us a reasonably accurate representation of the human skeleton. There's quite a few validation studies that have come out to show how close the Theia markerless is, this multi-camera approach, relative to what you might know as classic motion capture, whether it's Vicon or Qualisys or OptiTrack or others, if you've been in a lab environment or seen some of this research before. But it was really important for us to have a comparable solution that didn't require us to have markers on the body, because we didn't know if some of these computer vision tools would just learn to see the markers, and we know that's not the case in the workplace. So we benchmarked everything to this Theia markerless mocap as our lab grade criterion standard. Just a quick example of what this looks like. So again, if you're looking at the underlying skeleton and specifically the dots that represent where the joint, approximated joint centers are, the visual validity test here, the ocular significance test, so to speak, you can see that it tracks very well. And as I mentioned, there's quite a few scientific papers that document this in a more rigorous way. So we felt comfortable that this is a reasonably good criterion to test back all of the individual cameras to. So like I mentioned, we had the support of a number of different commercially available tools. What you see here is 5 different tools, all captured from the 90 degrees from the primary motion of the task. And we were benchmarking each of these back to our Theia system. So we had a really unique opportunity to learn about each of these tools. What I want to draw your attention to is how each of the tools describes the skeleton. So for example, the top right has 2 shoulders and 2 hip markers, kind of creating the torso as a square. The second image in the top has a single line that connects down from the neck to the hips. They look subtly different, but I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, because functionally it's quite important when we're thinking about H's and V's that might be associated with a NIOSH or a Liberty Mutual equation, for example. H's and V's being the horizontal or vertical distance from the floor to the hands at origins and destinations. So how do we calculate differences? Well, we can take our Theia data. We have fairly sophisticated biomechanical modeling software that we have available to us in the lab. So we can have a fairly accurate depiction of what the various joint angles are. So what you see in the scribble plot here is, say, a left shoulder joint angle. And then we can take the various views from each of the computer vision softwares, and we can compare them. And we can calculate the difference. So what I want to report on briefly here are some of the differences that we observed between software platforms, but also between different angles. So using the same software platform, but capturing video from different angles. And for those that haven't seen some of these results, it's quite compelling. So what we'll look at is just, I'm going to snapshot a couple examples here. But as you see in the top right, this is the simulated kind of overhead working task. On the graph, on the y-axis, so up and down the vertical, you'll see the mean absolute difference. So this is the mean difference across the whole sort of time trial. The mean difference of what we captured with the single camera smartphone relative to what was captured with the multi-camera Theia system. And when we view from the right, we get about 10 degrees of difference. But if we view from the anterior left, for example, and you can see just below the bars what the vantage point looks like, the error climbs quite a bit. Now, this isn't surprising. If I'm trying to capture the right shoulder angle and you can see it's blocked out, what we can take from this, and it's probably quite intuitive, computer vision is not magic. We can't, magically make up information. If the computer can't see it, or sorry, if the camera can't see it, if your eyes can't see it, the computer vision's probably not going to be able to understand what's happening as well as we might suspect. So we really think this is important to remind folks that, it's not a magical solution. There are times when computer vision will work well and times when it won't work well. And I'll summarize some of those high-level points in a few moments. If we look across the other vantage points, again, it kind of varies between the best case scenario, which is seeing the body part that we want to capture and seeing it from 90 degrees from the plane of motion, relative to having some sort of obstruction where we really can't see much at all. So that's just, again, a snapshot example. If I do the same sort of snapshot example for the palletizing task, the same story comes out. So because now I'm more looking at the spine angle, not a specific left or right shoulder angle, I can capture the task from either the left side or the right side, much like we've probably been trained to capture video data if we're just capturing still frames for traditional analyses. When we capture from 90 degrees from the plane of motion, again, about 10 degrees of difference relative to our Theia system. If we capture, if you just look on the bottom of the X, along the x-axis here, if we capture from the back or from the front, that error starts to jump up a little bit. And perhaps not surprisingly, even if you're watching somebody perform a movement where they're moving towards you or away from you, that depth can sometimes be a little bit tricky to capture. And again, with this current smartphone technologies, in the absence of LiDAR or some of the other detectors, that depth axis is going to be a little bit tricky. So it's not surprising that we have a little bit more of a difference from those particular vantage points. And again, the remaining perspectives kind of fall in between those best and worst case scenarios. What about if we look across the different vendors? So now I'm, again, back looking for that overhead work task, which you can see on the top right of your screen. And now when we look across different companies, there's 2 points that I think are really important to take away from this. And I apologize, I know there's four plots on the screen, lots of data to look at. But I'm drawing your attention to the green highlighted areas. And if you look across all 4 vendors, the left vantage point for this particular task, again, 90 degrees from the joint of interest, 90 degrees from the plane of motion, seeing the joint of interest. So I'm not trying to guess at what the right side, the far side's doing. I'm trying to see what the close side is doing. For all of those, the best camera angle was when they could see the body part at 90 degrees. There was a little bit of variation. Some softwares you could move off axis a little bit. And it all depends on how they trained their underlying models and what training data they use and et cetera. But this was a robust finding to, I think, reinforce to us that this is an overarching principle that regardless of the technology that you're using, it's probably going to work best when you can see the body part in motion, when you film from 90 degrees relative to the plane of motion. The other piece I want to highlight is that once you move out of plane, different solutions performed differently in terms of mean absolute difference. So if you look in the bottom left, for example, company 3, whether you moved from anterior left to right to posterior right to anterior right, etc., across the x-axis, we do see some changes but that mean absolute difference stays relatively constrained to a small zone. However, if you look at company 1, for example, or company 4, for example, if we move to that anterior right perspective, the error went up quite a bit. One of the reasons for this is, and this is an important note for those in the market looking for a potential markerless computer vision solution, some solutions, the algorithms will kind of assign a confidence band. So let's say I'm 75% confidence I can track that angle correctly. I'm 80% confidence I can track that level correctly. And if the software deems that it can't track it with a sufficient level of confidence, it won't give you any data at all. So you don't know what's happening, but you don't have misinformation. However, there are other approaches and other algorithms that won't correct for confidence. So the computer will always give you an answer, whether it's confident or not. And in cases like that, that's where we see this kind of company 1 anterior right in the top left plot, or in the bottom right plot, that forest green, the anterior right, the far right bar. Those are situations where the systems didn't perhaps share data that might not have had high confidence in. So it might have tried to predict what was happening when it couldn't see. Turns out we're not great at predicting yet. So that's a really important question to ask your vendor is, how do you deal with situations where the computer vision might not be confident that it's really seeing the data well. So that's a point I just highlight for everybody to take away as you're exploring these types of systems. Similarly, this is the results for palletizing. So now we're looking at the trunk angle here. And again, same story. If you film from the left or the right, regardless of the software solution that we tested, the minimum amount of difference relative to our criterion system almost always occurred in the when the motion was filmed from 90 degrees from the sagittal plane. So again, reinforcing that I think we can have some level of trust in these tools if the information is filmed from a viewing angle that really allows the camera to capture the motion and to see the joints of interest. Now, I talked a lot about 9 to 10 degrees of difference relative to the system. So is it okay? Like, is 10 reasonable? What should we expect? So just to do a little thought experiment here, I have this little simple image. This is about the extent of my artistic ability here. I have an individual standing upright, and imagine their arms are extended at the shoulder by 90 degrees. So I have a 90-degree angle between the upper arm and the torso. Now, again, with computer vision, what the camera is trying to do is identify key points. So let's assume for a second it's trying to estimate where is the middle of the wrist and where is the middle of the low back. And you can imagine if you think of waist circumference, let's imagine that the smartphone camera guesses at where the center is and misses by, let's say, 20 millimeters, so 2 centimeters. Let's say it does the same at the wrist. And if we can imagine for the torso, 20 millimeters left or right, given the dimensions of the torso, not a massive amount. But if that's the case, if we've misrepresented by up to 20 mils, that would cause us to quote, see with the computer vision an angle of almost 96 degrees. Conversely, what if we happened to, randomly by chance, have about a 20 mil offset, it just happens to be in the other direction? Well, now we get about, 84 degrees. We put those together, there's about a plus or minus, there's about 10-degree difference in joint angles, just because how a marker could be seen might fluctuate by, up to 20 mils left or right. So I contextualize this to say that when we're looking at capturing computer vision from an optimal angle, we tend to see that the shoulders have about 8 to 10 degree difference. The trunk is about 8 degrees different overall. And what that's probably driven by is, about a 1 to 2 to 2.5 centimeter offset in how it might be trying to estimate joint centers for the underlying key points that the computer vision is looking at. So it's probably reasonable in terms of what's feasible, even if we were to do this by eye and try to estimate where somebody's joint centers were, for example. The other point I want to make is that what we're actually trying to do is capture what the bones are doing under the skin. And I don't actually know how well our Theia system tracks bone motion. We haven't seen any research come out of that. I know when we're looking at markered motion capture relative to, X-rays and bone motions, we see about the same difference. We see that the markered systems estimate joint centers, plus or minus about 1.6 to 1.7 centimeters, or 16 to 17 mils. So we're in the ballpark of probably what motion capture is doing relative to underlying bone motion. So just to wrap up this section, should you consider using computer vision for your ergonomics assessments? Yes, but it's not point and shoot. So there is some necessity to plan what you're doing, make sure the camera can see what it needs to see in terms of the joints of interest. And training and guidance is going to be really important in terms of tracking the data. So are the technologies easy to use? Relatively, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I think it's not just as simple as give everybody a phone and point and shoot. There are some thoughtful processes that have to happen in the background to understand how to best capture that data and when not to rely on a camera as well. And I'll talk about that as we get into the NIOSH analysis here. So like I said, it's not point and shoot, but more of kind of plan, point, and verify, I think is probably a better way to frame this. So just to sum up what we've learned, video recording angle really matters. It's really important that you capture from an optimal angle. If you can't capture from that optimal angle, that might be a situation where maybe you want to explore other technologies, or maybe you want to capture with AI and cross-check with a manual assessment. Again, kind of as we learn how to use these tools, it's going to be important to do a little bit of AI and human intervention to figure out where these sweet spots are in terms of when we can completely trust the AI and when we need more human in the loop interaction. I talked about the optimal capture view is really dependent on the platform itself, but also on being able to see this segment of interest. And I didn't talk much about movement pace because we found that it didn't make much of a difference. We thought that if folks moved faster, we would have more image blur, which might make it harder for the computer vision to see and to detect where the joint angles were. In our particular case, where we had folks moving at, rates of movement that would be very typical on the line at, say, Cargill, we just weren't seeing much blur in the underlying image, which meant it didn't have that much effect. Now, obviously, if we were looking at let's say baseball pitching, for example, where arm movements are much higher, it's strongly likely that we would need to go to a higher capture rate, because if we just captured our standard 30 hertz that our phones use, it's unlikely. It is likely that we have more blur and more error, but all this to say, contextually, for the paces that we typically see in most work environments, it's unlikely that movement pace is going to drastically influence the result. But to borrow a phrase from Lenny Kravitz, what I really want to know is, can we use computer vision for revised NIOSH lifting equation analyses? So what I want to do is first say, yes, I can use it practically. So what I've done here is just taken a quick screen capture. So this was with InSeer technology. And what I'm going to do is upload a video, and I'm going to walk through an RNLE analysis. So you can see in the top left, I've uploaded a video, just like one of the ones from our study. And in InSeer, I can populate it with a little bit of information. The height is particularly important. I can upload my video. The speed it takes to upload your video obviously is dependent on the size of the video and your data transfer rate, your internet connection. But with most technologies today, it will upload quite quickly. Now I can go find my task amongst all of the other tasks I perhaps have looked at, and I see this status is queued. This just means that the background model is running on the server. It took about 30 seconds, I sped it up. But now I can actually run my assessment. I'm just going to confirm some details here. Again, I know that was fast. They're just standard details around height and weight and things. But now I can get into parameterizing my lift. So am I handling loads? Yes, I am. Am I using one hand, two hand, both hands? I'm using both. What's my load weight? Well, in this case, 15 pounds. Now I can use the cursors to identify start and stop of lift. Future iterations will do this automatically, but for a host of reasons, it's probably good to have some human in the loop here as a confirmation step. I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to I'm going to window out the lower. You notice I get some time series data about different joint angles, which is wonderful. I can look at some other information around speed and force related to the movement. But in this particular application, what I want to see is the NIOSH. So again, despite knowing the origin and destination in terms of the H's and V's, which now come out of the computer vision, I need to give it a little bit more information about how long we're doing the task, what the coupling is, what the frequency is. So it's not completely automated. There's certainly some manual human in the loop intervention as well to populate some of the data. Done. So now I get a composite lift index if I was combining those two lifts. I also get a lifting index for each individual lift. I get a pie chart that talks a little bit about, which factors are leading in terms of driving the risk up. So lift frequency in this case for the lift, and then looking at the lower here, followed by horizontal hand location. So this is, again, just an example of how the computer vision is being used to augment the analysis. What I didn't have to do is go measure H's and V's. I did have to measure the weight, obviously, and have some information about the task frequency. But then from a usability perspective, what I really like is how it helps me understand really quickly what's driving up that lifting index score. So I can see right away that, lift frequency is really a driver here. Maybe that's a variable that can be manipulated, maybe not. If not, then I can look towards horizontal hand location. And again, maybe there's an engineering control that can allow me to change some of that. Maybe there's not. The other point I want to draw your attention to is if you look in the very bottom table, it says variable, input type, origin value, etc. That input type, what I like about this particular software is that it gives me insight to know where the data came from. So lift frequency and coupling, for example, came from my manual intervention, me being human in the loop here, and the rest of that data came from vision. Now, as we're learning and evolving and developing trust with these technologies, in the back end, I can actually augment this and I could change those, and those would switch to manual. So if I wanted to manually update one of these because I didn't trust it, or perhaps I wanted to manually update because I couldn't film from that ideal angle and I wasn't quite certain, so I validated. Certainly easy to do. And again, we're kind of in this stage where we're experimenting with how well do these tools work, how much do I trust them to automate parts of the ergonomic assessment process, and how much do I still want to have the ability to be human in the loop and have some manual intervention. So we're still in this gray area of figuring out how much we trust it and how much we still want to be in the loop, which I think is a really important for the time being. But now we know it's feasible to do. How well does it work? So similarly to the first study, what we wanted to know is, how do things like angle of video recording influence the calculation of the recommended weight limit, and particularly relative to our lab grade motion capture system again. So, same as we talked about before, folks were lifting a milk crate about 5.7 kgs. And the two tasks I'm going to talk about here are a floor to shoulder lifting task. Obviously nobody's probably lifting at that pace in the field, but for a host of reasons, we needed to simulate that as an edge case in our study. And then on the right, you see palletizing, where our participant is just moving boxes back and forth. What's nice about the palletizing is because it's multi-planar, it imposes some different challenges on the computer vision. So we can see how it works best case, looking at simple floor to shoulder lifting, and we can see how it can be challenged when thinking about something like palletizing. So in this particular study, we only looked at one computer vision solution for ease of time. But what you see here is the same lifting task captured from 4 different perspectives, as shown by the colored blocks on the right of the screen. And the question is, do we get the same answer when we look from the different perspectives? Or if we don't, how different are those answers? And particularly, how different are they relative to our criterion standard? So again, as we talk about the NIOSH, there's obviously some variables that we need to pull. There's a number of variables: horizontal distance, vertical location, vertical travel distance, asymmetry angle, that come directly from the computer vision. And then we set the frequency and the coupling. They were just considered as constants for the study. and use that to calculate out the RWL, the recommended weight limit. How do we compare the data? Well, one way we compared the data was through what's known as a Bland-Altman analysis. So this analysis allows us to take each of these dots represents a lift, and we take the value of the RWL, the recommended weight limit that we get from our baseline system and from our computer vision system. We take an average of that. That becomes our value that we plot on the x-axis. And we also take the difference between those measures on the y-axis. What this allows us to do is understand what the bias might be in the different systems, and then the upper and lower limits of agreement, which typically define kind of 95% confidence intervals. So we're 95% confident that the answer would lie within that range. Now, what you see here, and this is just an exemplar, is this would show a small bias. So it means that in this case, one system would be maybe overestimating relative to the other system, and then we'd probably have plus or minus half a kilogram around that. So I'll textualize this in the next slide here. So when we look at the mean bias and the limits of agreement, and we look at the lift origin, much like we saw with the previous study, we have the lowest levels of bias when we're viewing from the left perspective or the right perspective. So reinforcing that it's really important to capture data at approximately 90 degrees from the plane of motion. In this case, if we filmed from the back of the lifter, the bias was upwards of 4 kilograms. So I think this supports that we probably don't want to be relying on computer vision to support lifting analysis when we can only see from maybe the front or the back of the individual. Now, this might change over time as some of the AI technologies evolve, but at current state, again, much like we would for classic analyses, we want to view these things from the sagittal plane. Similarly, between lift origin and destination, we do notice at destination, so when the arms were a little bit higher up in the air, that bias actually decreased a little bit, which I think is interesting. But we'll contextualize that a little bit more here. So when we're looking at the origin, and this is back to our Bland-Altman plot here, when I film a lift from 90 degrees from the sagittal plane, so I film the lift from the left or the right, each of these dots, again, represent the RWL captured via the single camera system and the multi-camera system in a Bland-Altman type format. What I see is that the computer vision solution estimated an RWL that was about 55 kilograms above, sorry, not 55 kilograms, 0.55 kilograms, half a kilogram, more than what might have been predicted when we use the data directly from our criterion system. And I see that the limits of agreement here, again, are about 0.25. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. But 0.5, half a kilogram, reasonable. But we were curious about, could that be a little bit better? So we dug into some of the deeper dive data. And we looked specifically at horizontal hand distance, because it's well established that the NIOSH RWL is quite sensitive to the horizontal hand distance input. So we started there first. And what we learned is that the computer vision system tended to detect the hand center about 7 centimeters closer to the body than what was being detected by the multi-camera system. And if we have, a shorter horizontal distance, that means the multiplier stays closer to 1, which means the RWL stays a little bit higher. So that was explaining why, or partially explaining why the computer vision system was estimating a less conservative or a more liberal RWL value. So if we dove into that a little bit more, it turned out that, computer vision obviously is quite complicated. Models are trained to see very specific key points, but the NIOSH analysis is also requires us to see specific key points, like the third knuckle specifically. And with our marker, our lab-based data, we could easily, capture that. What we learned was that the computer vision was seeing a location on the hand that wasn't exactly the same. So we were able to work with the vendor and update that in the model. So we could actually correct that underlying issue. And again, a lot of respect for the companies that are willing to iterate and evolve, because this is quite complex. And while I just showed this as just moving a marker on a screen very simply, it's really much more complicated in terms of the underlying architecture of these models and what they're trained to see and how we might move some of these around. So this was, I think, a wonderful addition. So now we kind of reran an analysis with a number of new participants and new lifters now that we had an updated model. And what you see here is the same Bland-Altman plot for lots of different lifters. Different participants are represented by different colors. So we had about 25 participants in this study here. And there was a range, obviously, but when we look at the mean bias, after correcting for that hand location offset, the mean bias in RWL came down to, 0.03 kilograms. The limits of agreement were 0.46 to minus 0.52. So almost, a negligible bias plus or minus half a kilogram. So we would be pretty confident that, would be 95% confident, in fact, that the RWL coming out of computer vision, when captured from 90 degrees perpendicular to the motion, is plus or minus half a kilogram. If I put that in context, so again, computer vision, a mean bias of 0.03 plus or minus about half a kilogram. Let's put that in context. There was a study back in 98 led by Tom Waters, and they looked at humans. So they trained 27 raters through a one-day training. 8 weeks later, brought them back in and had them conduct a NIOSH in the classical way, measuring heights, measuring vertical distances, horizontal distances, etc., weights, and compared what their mean bias was and their limits of agreement. And what they found is that the mean bias was about 0.05, and the limits of agreement were plus or minus 0.8. Now, they calculated limits of agreement slightly differently, but this was really interesting because what we see is that it's, best case scenario in terms of filming almost replicates what humans are doing in terms of the variability that we see. So this was a really promising finding. Now, I mentioned that sagittal plane lifting, it's sanitized, it's controlled, it's really simple. What if we extend this to palletizing, where we have a little bit more dynamics? We would expect the mean bias and the limits agreement to change. There's more variability, more things can quote unquote go wrong or be miscaptured. But let's see what that looks like. So what we found across all of the different data points is we ended up with a mean bias of 0.26 kilograms. So it's a little higher than obviously 0.03, but a quarter kilogram with limits of agreement between 0.9 and 1.42. So it did raise a little bit, plus or minus sort of a kilogram around that 0.26 zone. But again, we would be confident in the RWL for a much more complex kind of palletizing task where people are putting their feet in different places repeatedly and changing around positions. So I think this is quite a robust finding to understand and contextualize how confident we can be in when. So just a few more slides here to wrap up. What does this mean? We've talked a little bit about the RWL, but we don't interpret the RWL. We make decisions based on the lifting index, the LI. And for those that haven't seen it, hopefully many have, but in 2019, Bob Fox and others came out with this really nice paper that looked at how we interpret risk based on NIOSH lifting equation and paired with some epidemiological data. And for many companies that have now adopted this, 1.5 has become the cutoff. So if there's an LI below 1.5, the job is generally deemed acceptable. Folks can go forward. If the LI is greater than 1.5, that would initiate some sort of action. So if we use that as a benchmark for a second, again, the lifting index equals what people actually did relative to the recommended weight limit. And I noted that the recommended weight limit has some variability. We have limits of agreement, whether we use computer vision or whether we use multiple humans. It's going to fluctuate a little bit, upwards plus or minus a quarter kilogram to plus or minus a kilogram, depending on the type of lift that's happening. So it means that the LI is going to fluctuate as well. And naturally, the place where this is going to be the most important is around the cut point. So what we did, and I apologize, it's a little busy. What we did is looked at how confident we would be in a lift index when the RWL, when the recommended weight limit, was calculated with computer vision. And obviously it depends on how heavy the actual mass is, because if the mass is lower, the impact of variability in RWL is much higher. If the actual mass is really high, it doesn't matter what the RWL is doing too much, it's probably going to be an unsafe lift. But what we did is we could model hundreds of different iterations. And what the model told us is that generally, if the LI value was 1.4 or less, we had upwards of 85% confidence if it was a really light load, or upwards of 95% confidence if it was an 8 kilogram load. All I'm doing is looking at where the lines cross from green to yellow and scrolling that over to the left. So we could be quite confident in values below 1.4 or values above 1.6 when using computer vision for looking at sagittal plane lifting and understanding what that lift index is. So our recommendation here is if the LI is less than 1.4, we trust the computer vision and the job's likely acceptable. The caveat being that it was filmed from the correct angle, as I mentioned earlier. And if it's greater than 1.6, again, we trust the computer vision, the job's likely unacceptable, we should probably intervene and make some changes. If the LI was 1.4 to 1.6, probably important to manually check this. And I would suggest this is probably good practice, even if you're doing these assessments manually. Somebody's getting a value close to the cut point, we probably want to investigate further, have somebody else maybe double up that assessment just to verify that we haven't, again, have a little bit of error and suddenly we're making a change when we don't need to, or we're not making a change when we should be, for example. Although some might say that maybe we shouldn't be as hard-lined on the 1.5. So just wrapping up here, some key takeaways. Again, computer vision, I think it can be a really effective tool for ergonomic assessment, but it's not going to solve all of our problems. It's use case specific. I have to be able to see, like the camera has to be able to see to compare. It's really important that we capture from the optimal angle. If we're using this as a point and shoot tool, we're probably going to be making poor decisions. If we're planning how we're capturing the data and doing this thoughtfully and capturing from the best vantage point, as close as possible to 90 degrees perpendicular from the plane of motion, we're going to get higher quality data that we can trust, have much more trust in. And lastly, I think what we're learning, and particularly through the NIOSH analysis here, that these tools can help us assess risk, but it's not independent of the human. It's still really important that we have humans in the loop to, augment around those decision barriers. I mentioned with the RNLE, we still need users to, define starts and ends of lifts. I know we might be able to automate that in the future, but there's points of interaction where we're not completely hands off the steering wheel here, but a little bit of driver assist to nudge us back in a lane, to use a car analogy. And lastly, just some closing thoughts. As we think about, what pixels to prevention might mean at scale. One, I think what we're seeing in the marketplace now with tools like computer vision, when used thoughtfully and judiciously, can help us, quote unquote, democratize ergonomics risk assessment. It does make ergonomics risk assessment more accessible to a broader audience. So what that means is we might not be limited to, a handful of certified ergonomists. Now, that obviously requires a little bit more thought and conversation because we do need some expertise behind the wheel. So we can, I think future conversations will talk about what the role will be of folks capturing and conducting the assessments versus brainstorming solutions, etc. Accuracy is highly dependent on protocols for use. So we can't ignore training. Again, I can't reiterate this enough. This is not a point and shoot solution. It's a useful tool, but it requires training and clear protocols to ensure that the data are sufficiently accurate for making judgments. The next frontier, I think with the addition of tools like computer vision, we can do a much better job of capturing cumulative exposures. And there was a question in the chat earlier following Nathan's presentation that looked into this. But I think what this might allow us to do is get better at what I'm going to say is capturing more of the risk pie, moving beyond single snapshots and understanding how the design of work, how the design and connection of different work tasks augments risk. So I'm really excited about what that future looks like. And lastly, it's likely that we're going to start to see more hybrid AI human systems. Now, as you can see in the image, we're not quite there yet. ChatGPT stuck some sort of odd obstacle in my head to connect with the robot. So it's not perfect yet, but we're certainly moving in that direction where AI is going to really help us augment how we consider MST prevention moving forward. So with that, I want to thank all of our team, thank all of our partners and our funders. And if folks are interested, the MST prevention guideline for Ontario, you can take a quick snapshot of that and have access to a number of tools and resources. So thank you.
Okay, so while Daryl just gets ready for the questions, the survey for the post for today's session just popped up. Please take a moment to complete that. Daryl, I'll let you start asking the questions.
Okay. Okay, so right off we got, what do you think the price will be for AI software for ergonomics specifically, right? Rather than regular ones that can be pricier?
Good question. I'm not sure. It depends. So if you wanted to introduce computer vision, there are open source tools like MediaPipe, which if you have a little bit of knowledge of sort of some simple coding, or you can use AI to help you generate your code, you can actually create your own. Now, I will say that the out of the box open source models are not as robust and strong, so the accuracy is not going to be there. A number of these companies have evolved models, evolved sophistication, trained with better data, so the accuracy is much higher in some of the commercial solutions. Each individual company has a different business model for how they price. Some embed in higher end solutions that support more than just risk assessment. Some have options to have a singular kind of computer vision tool that doesn't have other bells and whistles, so the price would be different. So I think that's something you'd largely want to check out in the market.
Okay. We're still there. So next question is, are there plans to publish these results?
Yes. So the study that we have a number of papers that are currently in review. As fast as they get reviewed and hopefully approved, they should be published shortly. So we're hoping within the next kind of 2 to 3 months, we'll have a series of these papers coming out that describe the data I talked about today in much more detail.
Okay, great. Can you recommend a specific vendor solution, or would you say it depends on the application?
I would say it depends on the application. Like I said, if you're filming from 90 degrees, they all perform reasonably well. They do differ in terms of how you interface with the software. They probably differ in terms of pricing models. They do differ in terms of their underlying architecture of how the models are trained. So like I said, some might work better in certain work environments. So I'd encourage anyone looking into this to investigate at least 2 or 3 and kind of feel out different relationships and things and capabilities, their nuanced differences.
Okay. And someone said, just wondering why you didn't use correlation coefficients instead to determine closeness of agreement between RWL and angles.
I just didn't show that data today.
Okay.
So we used Bland Altman. We used a Formula Nova, which is actually a test of differences, and then a correlation to look at similarities. Bland Altman tends to be stronger because it gives more clarity around, it's not just how similar or not similar, but what is the actual bias and how confident aren't we plus or minus. So we thought it might be a more useful tool for folks making decisions.
Okay. Would it be safe to assume that clothing worn by the worker, like loose or baggy clothing, will affect the video capture accuracy? And what if the clothing worn by the work is required bulky PPE that they can't remove for video capture? Is there any workaround?
One of the most common questions I get, and I don't have a good scientific answer yet. There's been a few studies that have looked at the effect of body shape and clothing on the ability for markerless motion capture to actually accurately collect the data that we're talking about. But it's only been on systems like Thea, like these multi-camera gold standard systems. So what we don't know is how that translates to the single camera systems that might have, don't have as many vantage points all at the same time. So it's a great question, and it remains an open question that we don't have good information on.
Okay. And would that be similar if there was multiple people in the room? I know I tried to do some research in a surgical room, and everyone wearing the same clothes. It was tough for the AI to.
Yeah, and this is so back to the question earlier around different software solutions. Some of the models handle this better than others in terms of identifying multiple people in the space. Some of them have upper limits on how many people it can identify successfully. And some have a human in the loop option where you can actually tag and kind of relabel which human is which if necessary. So again, it's kind of an interesting challenge. I think we have solutions that are quite robust, and different companies are introducing those in different ways.
And have you done any work in comparison to sensors that are worn on people?
Yeah, we're actually just the team is literally in the lab right now analyzing some of the XSense data that we collected alongside. XSense is like an inertial motion unit that can track body segments in time. So we've been doing some of that comparative work. When we look at the literature that compares things like X sensors or IMUs to motion capture, to a kind of a gold standard, we tend to see the same ranges of difference, about 8 to 10 degrees. So that seems to be consistent. Now, what I don't know yet is IMU to single camera. So we're just I have a student right now, Justin Davidson, that's working on some of that right now.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions there.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve, and thank you also, Nathan. That was great. I know I get nervous, Steve, that AI is going to put us out of work. So I'm glad to know we're still safe for a while.
I think it's going to help us, but we are going to work differently.
No, that's great. And I thank you both for attending and speaking here today. And I'd like to thank everyone for being with us. And I wish you all a good week. And we will see you next week for our final session of the year. Thank you very much and have a good weekend.